Imagine this, you're 18 years old, waiting in Greece to join Julius Caesar on a military campaign, when suddenly news arrives. Caesar is dead. Not defeated in battle, not killed by a foreign enemy, murdered in Rome by the very senators that claimed they were saving the Republic. For most men, this would have been their end, as they would have become politically irrelevant. But for Octavian, the boy who would later become Augustus, it was the beginning of a political rise which would shape the ancient world. Over the next decade, Rome would be pulled into civil war, betrayal, propaganda, and military violence, until one man stood above everybody else and proclaimed himself as princeps, or the so-called first citizen of Rome. That man, of course, was Augustus. At least, that's the version history remembers. Behind Augustus's image as Rome's saviour, behind the marble statues and carefully curated propaganda, there was another man. A man who won the battles Augustus needed won, built the fleets Augustus needed built, made leaps in infrastructural development across Rome, and held key religious and administrative roles, and made possible the regime Augustus would later claim to be his own creation. Without him, I would argue, Augustus would have never become princeps. This man was Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. Mutina, a republic in ruins. To understand why Agrippa was so integral to Octavian and his eventual empire, we must understand Octavian's fragile position. This is because when Caesar died, Octavian was not Augustus. He was not emperor. He was not Rome's master. He was an 18-year-old aristocratic teenager with a famous name, a dangerous inheritance, and almost no power of his own. Yes, Octavian was adopted in Caesar's will, and that gave him some political clout, so to speak. But it also put a target on his back, and it gave him a necessity to fulfill his filial duty. Octavian's first attempt at warfare was at the Battle of Mutina in 43 BCE. Here, Octavian fought alongside consuls Hirtius and Pansa, as well as his childhood friend Agrippa. These men fought against Octavian's main political rival, Mark Antony, who, like Octavian, promoted himself as Julius Caesar's rightful heir. This battle, and defeating Antony, was crucial, as Antony was the older, more experienced, and more politically savvy of the two. This meant he had more political experience and power than the rising star Octavian. However, according to Suetonius, 150 years or so later, in his account of the divine Augustus, this battle was largely a failure for Octavian, as it spurred political propaganda and conspiracy against him, despite the fact Octavian won. Suetonius reports that Octavian humorously fell off his horse in battle and did not appear until the next day. When he did appear, however, his appearance was dishevelled and he looked quite out of it. Suetonius also claims that Octavian played a role in the deaths of Hirtius and Pansa, as he claims Octavian killed them in order to claim their consulship as his own. This matches Octavian's later move, as he had control of an army, so he decided to storm Rome and demand the Senate that he be given a consulship. This was controversial for two reasons. Firstly, Octavian was far too young to be a consul. The minimum age to assume such a powerful role in the Republic was 42. Secondly, Octavian secured this position by threatening the Senate. The Senate at this time didn't have an army, as Rome was at civil war, and Octavian essentially said, if you do not give me these roles, I will not pursue Antony. Hence, Octavian's initial military victory was clouded in controversy, scandal, and as the classical scholar Mary Beard puts, illegality and sadism. So, Mutina tells us one crucial thing about the young Octavian's political tendencies. Octavian could seize opportunity, but he was not yet a reliable military commander. His political ambition was there, certainly, but the practical military machinery still needed better hands. Philippi, still in Antony's shadow. By 42 BCE, Agrippa had fought a civil war. He was on the side of Octavian. However, his role in this initial war was insignificant. His role at the Battle of Philippi was similar too. Now, Agrippa was almost certainly part of Octavian and Antony's campaign, as they temporarily allied as part of the Second Triumvirate. They were not genuinely allied in the fact that Octavian and Antony actually liked each other, but rather they allied to fulfill their so-called filial duty, or pietas. This was because they had to defeat Brutus and Cassius, Julius Caesar's main two assassins. However, both Agrippa and Octavian, due to their young age, were overshadowed by the matured Antony, as his military experience effectively won them the battle. This is because Octavian's military ability was inhibited by illness which he sustained at Dyrrhachium. Agrippa was also rather unknown as he came from a plebeian family, hence his role in this battle is thinly documented. Also, Mark Antony simply just outshone both men in the battle. This led to him chasing Cassius and him committing suicide, and he later did the same to Brutus. So it looked at this point that Antony would simply assume sole leadership of Rome, and Octavian and his childhood friend Agrippa would eventually fade into political irrelevance. The Perusine War. Agrippa emerges. Agrippa's importance starts to show during the Perusine War. This was fought from 41 BCE to 40 BCE, and was against Lucius Antonius, the younger brother of Mark Antony, and Fluvia, Mark Antony's wife. So although Mark Antony wasn't directly involved, it can be assumed that the pair were either fighting a war on Antony's behalf, or at least a war with Antony's interests in mind. Lucius had raised an army of 8 legions, and like Octavian in 43 BCE, had stormed Rome for a brief time and held it. During this time, Lucius convinced Rome that Octavian was the real enemy. Octavian, being informed of Rome's seizure, hastened towards Rome to expel Lucius. This was achieved successfully by Octavian. However, fearing political instability in Rome, he decided to stay there and, soften the tensions. This meant that he allocated the job of pursuing Lucius to Agrippa. Here we see Agrippa's first important military role. The first move of Agrippa, who had been pursuing Lucius for some time now, was to seize Sutrium. It's reported that Agrippa seized this area on purpose. This is because he feared his ally, Salwindinus, would be surrounded. This move works as Agrippa expected. Lucius diverted, which allowed Agrippa to pressure him until he withdrew to Perusia. Agrippa then advanced north and met his ally, where Lucius's army was starved out and eventually led to Lucius having to surrender. Lucius was actually spared, probably because killing him would have made the relationship between Octavian and Antony unreconcilable. Fluvia also survived, however she soon died after Mark Antony had exiled her to Sicyon. With Fluvia dead, this permitted a new marriage to take place. This was Antony's marriage to Octavian's sister, Octavia. This shows an attempt at reconciling the pair's relationships, and perhaps a merging of power, which would be shared, not a sole rulership. However, diplomacy aside, Agrippa's key and prominent role in this war shows that he was certainly a strategic aid for Octavian. However, at this stage, Agrippa wasn't indispensable. He was useful, certainly, but his victories were not politically necessary. They were also completed alongside other competent allies, which, in some sense, takes away from Agrippa's military genius, as the battle was won and the triumph was shared. However, this all changed with one enemy: Sextus Pompey. Sextus Pompey, the naval problem Octavian could not solve. Sextus Pompey was the son of Pompey the Great, who was a member of the first triumvirate. This meant, like Octavian, he too had political clout, and also like Octavian, was fighting to fulfill his filial duty. However, Sextus had something which Octavian greatly lacked, and this was naval dominance. Sextus was anti-Caesarian, most likely due to his father's complicated relationship with Caesar. This was much like Brutus and Cassius. So after their defeat at Philippi, Sextus effectively became the de facto leader of all men which wanted to restore the Republic. This is because many enemies of Octavian actually fled to Sextus in Sicily after the Battle of Philippi. This meant that Sextus was effectively the public enemy number 1 of Rome, and this was declared during the proscriptions of the Second Triumvirate. This led to the start of the Bellum Sicilianum, or in English, the Sicilian War. This image, and Sextus being the antagonist of Rome, was made more significant by his numerous military blockades. This meant that crops, supplies, and grain were unable to enter Rome, which in turn nearly caused a plethora of famines and shortages. However, in 39 BCE, a peace treaty was signed. This was called the Pact of Misenum. which enabled the end of the blockade and allowed crops and sort to travel to the Italian peninsula. Momentarily, this was a success. However, one of the terms of the treaty was that Sextus was actually granted quite a lot of land. This included Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and Peloponnese, along with the promises of being a future agorate and a consulship. Specifically, these things would start in 33 BC. However, this peace was fragile and short-lived. This was because Mark Antony, probably because of his ego, refused to relinquish control of Peloponnese. This led to a renewal of tensions and hostilities between Rome and Sicily, and the eventual continuing of the war with, as Augustus says in the Res Gestae, the pirates. In 38 BCE, an attempt was made by Octavian to overthrow Sextus. This was through a naval invasion of Sicily. However, due to poor planning and poor weather, Octavian was forced to retreat. This was before the invasion even began. In 37 BCE, this time with better weather conditions, Octavian tried again. This was called the Battle of Messina. However, Octavian's attempt to capture the military base which Sextus held was unsuccessful, as he was betrayed by Menas. I think personally this is an example of Octavian's incompetency as a military leader. This is because Menas was originally one of Sextus's allies, however he switched sides. Now, if somebody did that, I think you'd be a bit skeptical and not very trustworthy of them. Hence, by Octavian giving him a role which obviously if he betrayed him would result in the failure of the battle or invasion, is kind of a rookie error. Hence, Octavian should have been more skeptical of the man or not accepted him as an ally. This shows that Octavian's political machine eventually breaks down when he meets more technical problems. And it's clear that from these two failed attempts, Octavian couldn't do this alone. This means Octavian's faltering results in him needing to call on military genius. And this comes in the form of the man, Agrippa. Agrippa, unlike Octavian, was far more strategic. The first part of his plan was to construct the Portus Julius. Interestingly, Agrippa did this by cutting part of the Lucrine Lake and connecting it to the sea. This port was constructed by Agrippa not only for its geographic importance, but also that the lake was actually invisible from the surrounding sea and bay waters. And Agrippa reasoned from this that his great fleet which he was constructing here would be able to be kept a secret from Sextus, essentially enabling a surprise attack. Virgil, one of Augustus's most important poetic propagandists, actually called this port one of the great man-made wonders of Italy. Not only was the port useful for constructing ships, it was actually multifaceted in its use. This is because it enabled the men to train and perform mock battles. This was incredibly effective, as it allowed the men to understand what they were going against. Eventually, in 36 BCE, Agrippa's ships sailed to Sextus's stronghold, and here Agrippa defeated him. In contrast, Octavian, who invaded at the same time, was seriously wounded and defeated. However, Agrippa, wanting to avenge his friend, eventually caught up to Sextus at Nulla, and through superior artillery and manoeuvring, he blocked Sextus's fleet, destroyed the ones he could, as the remaining 17 ships fled. Now this is the moment, I would argue, Agrippa went from childhood friend to a political necessity for Octavian. This is because Octavian had failed 3 times against Sextus. However, Agrippa was able to solve the problem of Sextus in his first attempt. This meant that on his own accord, Agrippa was able to eliminate one of Rome's most feared and powerful enemies. This meant that there was only one rival now for Octavian to defeat before he became the uncontested owner of the known world, and this was Mark Antony, and arguably Agrippa did this himself. In the second part of the 3rd decade BCE, tensions were now at their highest. Antony, in 37 BCE, had married the late Julius Caesar's lover, Cleopatra, and fled Rome to live in Egypt with her. From this, Antony had committed the literal crime of polygamy. He had abandoned Octavia, Octavian's sister, and he had turned his back on Rome, and as Paul Zanker calls him, the second Dionysus. Antony had also used Cleopatra's wealth. This was in order to complete a military campaign in Armenia in 34 BCE. I think the idea with Antony doing this was to show Rome that he is still a competent military leader. And to be fair, he did this pretty effectively, and he defeated the Armenians. However, despite his military success, his politics were absolutely disastrous. This is because he chose not to hold the triumph in Rome, as everyone usually did, but to hold it in Alexandria. This was called the Donations of Alexandria, and they were held in Cleopatra's honour. Here, the pair dressed as gods and goddesses, Antony dressing as Dionysus and Cleopatra as Isis, and Antony named Cleopatra in front of her court Queen of Kings. All of these events culminated in Octavian's unconstitutional and controversial masterstroke. This is because he stole Antony's will from the Vestal Virgins and read it aloud to the Senate. Allegedly, it read that Antony desired to be buried in Egypt next to Cleopatra, not in Rome. Octavian doubled down on Antony's political failings by constructing his own epically proportioned mausoleum in the centre of Rome. This promoted the image that, unlike Antony, Octavian wanted to lie in Rome eternally, which of course was a representation of his dedication to the city. However, despite Octavian's masterful political imagery, he was quite aware that a full-scale invasion of Egypt would be costly economically and costly to life. Knowing such the importance of an event which could, in my opinion, turn the tide of history, and knowing it would be a naval battle, he called upon the only person he thought competent enough to complete such a task. And I think it comes to no surprise that this is Agrippa. Agrippa, knowing the importance of preparation from his military battles with Sextus, showed his genius by winning the battle before it had even begun. Here he captured positions in western Peloponnese, cut Antony's communications, and isolated him, making it harder to supply his army. More importantly, Agrippa captured Cleopatra's and Antony's main supply base at Methone in southwestern Greece. This cut off supplies to Antony's army, which made them trapped, hungry, and a deteriorating force before the battle had even started. This meant that when the battle started on the 2nd of September 31 BCE, Antony and Cleopatra were already compromised. This was made worse as their ships were much larger in size but less in quantity than Agrippa's and Octavian's. This meant that they were far slower. This permitted Agrippa to actually flank and outmaneuver the ships. Fortunately for Antony and Cleopatra, they were able to break free from the blockade and escape with the treasury. However, the remaining fleet, lacking their leader and their queen, eventually surrendered to Octavian and Agrippa. After the failure which was Actium for Antony and Cleopatra, they eventually retreated to Egypt. They were closely pursued by Octavian and Agrippa, who arrived in Alexandria in 30 BCE. Antony was the first to die, as he committed suicide, believing that Cleopatra had also done so. However, Cleopatra later killed herself after meeting with Octavian and attempting to seduce the man. However, Octavian, knowing the seduction that she'd done on his father and Antony, resisted, and she eventually killed herself, believing that suicide was more honourable compared to being triumphed around Rome and then eventually killed anyway. So Actium had removed Antony as a serious political rival, and after Alexandria, Octavian was no longer a faction leader among many. He was the only man left with any military, political, and symbolic power which allowed him to dominate Rome. Hence, Octavian here won the name, the image, and the constitutional settlement. But Agrippa helped and made the conditions in order for those things to happen possible. Without Actium, there is no Augustus, and without Agrippa, Actium is far less certain. Agrippa's development in infrastructure What people forget about Agrippa is not only that he won Augustus's wars and essentially the empire, but that Agrippa made infrastructural leaps for this empire. Starting in 33 BCE, Agrippa served as an aedile. This was important because this role was responsible for public buildings, streets, public order, and games. The fact that Agrippa, who was already a consul at this time, accepted a lower position is useful. This is because it shows that he was willing to do the practical work which made Augustus's regime so popular. It is said that Agrippa would actually toss tokens to plebeians throughout Rome. These tokens could be exchanged for food and clothing. The fact that Agrippa came from a plebeian family shows that he was very considerate of the class which he came from. It also promotes the idea that he was a benevolent benefactor of Rome, someone willing to share wealth, not keep it for himself. Furthermore, Agrippa actually shared his land, as he donated some of his estate to be used as parklands or training grounds for military campaigns. Agrippa's largesse was not limited to just free handouts, but also served a more practical use. This is because he restored and built many aqueducts, such as the Aqua Julia, the Appia, the Anio Vetus, and the Marcia, and also supplied the city with many fountains. Later, after his third consulship, Agrippa also brought the Aqua Virgo into Rome. This is political power made physical, through promotions of public baths, better hygiene, and clean drinking water. These are practical things which improve the lives of Romans. Finally, Agrippa's most impressive and symbolic contribution to Augustus's building program was the Pantheon. This was built in 27 BCE, the same year Augustus became Augustus, and was solely funded by Agrippa. Some interpret that this temple was dedicated to the 12 Olympian gods, and Agrippa actually inscribed his name on the temple. This was one of the largest and most awe-inspiring buildings ever constructed in Rome, not only in its era, but throughout. And although the original one has been destroyed and we don't have it, it's still a extremely popular tourist attraction. So it shows that Agrippa's infrastructure stood the test of time, even 2,000 years later. Also, it showed his dedication to Rome. He was not just a military genius, but a man who cared about the people, cared about improving their lives. This shows that Agrippa had not only made Augustus possible on the battlefield, but in Rome, he made Augustus's regime visible. Aqueducts, baths, sewers, parks, public buildings, and the Pantheon turned victory into a lived experience. Augustus could claim he restored Rome, but Agrippa helped provide the physical imagery which made Augustus's claim possible. Now, from this video, I think we can see that Agrippa was integral to Augustus's reign from a military standpoint and an infrastructural standpoint. However, perhaps the man was becoming too powerful even to live. In Cassius Dio's account of Roman history, written 150 years after this supposed conversation happened, Maecenas, one of Augustus's closest allies and contributors to Rome, claimed that Augustus had made Agrippa too powerful even to live. Allegedly, he said that Augustus must either make him his son-in-law or kill him. Although the truth of this conversation is doubtful, and we should be, as historians, skeptical of it, it shows that a later Roman interpretation knew the power that Agrippa had and were skeptical of it. But Augustus, in 21 BCE, decided to marry Agrippa to his daughter Julia. Whether this was out of clementia, pietas, or simply a genuine and trusting relationship to the man, we'll never know. But what we do know is he chose to marry him rather than kill him. Agrippa's importance to Augustus's imperial family was not only limited to his life, but actually after it. This is because in 12 BCE, the same year Agrippa died, Agrippa can actually be seen on the northern frieze of the Areopagus, participating in a sacrificial procession. Augustus also adopted his sons, Lucius and Gaius, after his death, as he planned to make them heirs. Augustus also held a month-long public mourning procession for his good friend and closest ally Agrippa after his death. This was rather strange, as Augustus never did this for anybody else in his life. This tells us that Agrippa was a well-respected and beloved member of Augustus's imperial family. This reflects his importance in Augustus's political and personal life. Through this video, I've given an alternative perspective which traditional history books generally don't. History remembers Augustus as the empire's founder, but this video has shown that image to be incomplete. It's clear that, like Augustus, Agrippa's image evolved throughout his life. In times of civil war, Agrippa was the military technician which kept Augustus's politics alive. In times of peace, Agrippa became a civic benefactor of Rome through his numerous public works and advances in infrastructure, which improved Augustus's Rome. In Agrippa's later life, he became part of the imperial family which he built, and his legacy continued through this line. So, I think it would be fair to say Augustus became the face of the Roman Empire, but Agrippa was one of the strongest and most loyal hands which helped to build it. Thank you for watching.